What happens when two of the most outspoken women in entertainment sit down for what's supposed to be a friendly chat, only for it to spiral into one of the most uncomfortable exchanges ever broadcast on daytime television? Picture this: Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex herself, walking onto The View's iconic set with that practiced smile we've all seen 1,000 times. The audience is clapping, Whoopi Goldberg is settling into her seat at the table, and everything seems perfectly choreographed for another celebrity interview. But within minutes, the temperature in that studio shifted so dramatically that producers were scrambling. Cameras kept rolling despite the chaos, and what was meant to be a promotional appearance turned into a verbal showdown that nobody saw coming. This wasn't your typical celebrity disagreement. This was personal, this was raw, and by the end of it, security was involved and Meghan was escorted out of the building. Before we get into exactly what was said that caused everything to explode, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on after you hear this whole story, because trust me, you're going to have opinions. The invitation had come through official channels. Meghan's team had reached out to The View for what they described as an opportunity to discuss her latest philanthropic ventures and perhaps touch on some lighter topics about life in California. The View's producers jumped at it. Say what you will about Meghan Markle, but she brings ratings, she brings conversation, and she brings controversy. That's the trifecta of daytime television gold. The morning of the interview, everything backstage was operating like a well-oiled machine. Hair and makeup, lighting checks, the usual pre-show jitters that come with any big guest appearance. Meghan arrived with her team, all smiles and pleasantries, working the room like the experienced public figure she'd become when the show went live and Meghan made her entrance. The audience gave her the warm reception that guests typically receive. She hugged each of the hosts, saved her longest embrace for Whoopi, and settled into the guest chair with that composed demeanor she'd perfected over years in the spotlight. The first few minutes were textbook celebrity interview material. Joy Behar asked about the California weather compared to London. Sunny Hostin brought up some charity work. Sarah N. mentioned the kids in that vague, respectful way that doesn't pry too deep. Meghan answered everything with rehearsed charm, hitting all her talking points about compassion, activism, and finding her voice. But then Whoopi leaned forward, and you could see something shift in her expression. She had that look. You know the one. That look that says the pleasantries are over and we're about to have a real conversation now. Whoopi started simply enough, asking Meghan about the difference between speaking out on issues versus using a platform responsibly. It seemed like a softball question, the kind designed to let Meghan wax poetic about the importance of advocacy. Meghan launched into what sounded like a prepared answer about how staying silent in the face of injustice is complicity. How she'd learned the hard way that sometimes you have to ruffle feathers to create change. How her experiences had taught her the value of authenticity over approval. Whoopi nodded along for a bit, but then she interrupted. Not rudely, but firmly. She said something that changed the entire trajectory of the interview. She told Meghan that speaking out is one thing, but there's a difference between advocacy and grievance. She pointed out that there are people who use their platforms to elevate others, and then there are people who use their platforms to elevate their own narratives of victimhood. The studio got quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of an audience listening intently, but that awkward silence that happens when someone says something that makes everyone collectively hold their breath. Meghan's smile tightened just slightly at the corners. You could see her recalibrating in real time, trying to figure out if Whoopi was challenging her or just playing devil's advocate for good television. She responded carefully, saying that sharing your truth isn't playing victim, it's taking ownership of your story. She added that perhaps some people are uncomfortable when women, especially women of color, refuse to shrink themselves to make others comfortable. It was a pointed response, and there was an edge to her voice that hadn't been there moments before. Whoopi didn't back down. Instead, she leaned in further. She brought up the concept of perspective, how someone can feel wronged while simultaneously not acknowledging their own privilege in a situation. She mentioned, without naming names directly but clearly referencing Meghan's various public statements over the years, that there's something dissonant about claiming to want privacy while doing multiple high-profile interviews, about claiming to want normalcy while maintaining a celebrity lifestyle, about claiming to speak for the marginalized while living in a mansion in Montecito. The other hosts were exchanging glances now, Sarah tried to jump in with a lighter question, attempting to redirect the conversation, but Meghan spoke over her. That's when things really started to accelerate. Meghan's voice had lost all traces of that measured, media-trained quality. She told Whoopi that it was easy to judge from the outside, easy to make assumptions when you haven't lived through the specific pressures and attacks that she had endured. She said that dismissing someone's pain just because they're not living in poverty is exactly the kind of gatekeeping that keeps people silent. Whoopi's response was immediate and unflinching. She said she wasn't dismissing anyone's pain, but she was questioning the proportionality of the response. She pointed out that she herself had faced racism, sexism, and every other kind of discrimination throughout her career, but she'd never positioned herself as uniquely persecuted. She said there's strength in resilience, without constant publicity, in grace without grievance. She looked directly at Meghan and asked her point blank, "Do you want to be known for what you've overcome, or for how loudly you can talk about overcoming it?" The question hung in the air like a bomb. Meghan's face flushed. Her hands, which had been gesturing animatedly, suddenly gripped the armrests of her chair. She took a visible breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was shaking slightly. She told Whoopi that she had no right to determine how someone processes trauma, no right to set the acceptable parameters for how a person speaks about their experiences. She said that judging another woman for not suffering in silence was internalized misogyny at its finest. That last phrase, internalized misogyny, that's when Whoopi's entire demeanor changed. Up until that moment, she'd been firm but controlled. Now there was something else in her expression, something harder. She sat back in her chair, crossed her arms, and let out a small, incredulous laugh. She told Meghan that throwing around buzzwords doesn't win arguments, it just shuts them down. She said that calling someone a misogynist for disagreeing with you is lazy and intellectually dishonest. She added that if Meghan couldn't handle a challenging conversation without pulling out the identity politics trump cards, then maybe she wasn't as committed to authentic dialogue as she claimed to be. The audience was completely silent now, and you could feel the tension radiating through the screen. Joy Behar attempted to interject with a comment about how they could all agree to disagree, her voice carrying that nervous energy of someone trying to diffuse a situation that's already spiraling out of control. But neither Meghan nor Whoopi even acknowledged her. They were locked in now, two strong-willed women who had clearly reached a point where backing down felt like losing. Meghan leaned forward in her chair, mirroring Whoopi's earlier posture, and her voice took on a tone that was somehow both controlled and seething. She said that perhaps the real issue here was that Whoopi couldn't handle seeing a younger woman refuse to play by the old rules, refuse to suffer quietly the way her generation had been forced to. She suggested that maybe Whoopi's criticism came from a place of resentment, from watching someone else get opportunities to speak freely that Whoopi herself never had at the same age. She called it generational gatekeeping. This idea that because previous generations of women had it harder and stayed quieter, everyone who came after should do the same. Whoopi's laugh this time was sharp and humorless. She uncrossed her arms and placed both hands flat on the table in front of her, a gesture that somehow felt both grounding and threatening. She told Meghan that she was way off base with that analysis. She said she'd spent her entire career opening doors for other women, for other people of color, for anyone who'd been marginalized or silenced. She said she'd fought battles that Meghan couldn't even imagine, faced racism and sexism that would have broken someone with less spine. And she'd done it, she emphasized, without turning her entire life into a perpetual press tour about how hard she had it. Meghan's eyes were blazing now. She shot back that maybe that's exactly the problem, that Whoopi's generation normalized suffering in silence, made it noble to take abuse and smile through it. She said that what Whoopi called strength, younger generations recognized as survival mechanisms born from a lack of options. She insisted that speaking up, demanding better, refusing to accept mistreatment, that's the new definition of strength. That silence isn't dignity, it's complicity with your own oppression. Sunny Hostin tried to step in, her voice measured and diplomatic, suggesting that perhaps both perspectives had merit and reflected different approaches to similar struggles. But Whoopi held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Whoopi's full attention was still on Meghan, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped lower, more intense. She told Meghan that there's a difference between speaking truth to power and speaking truth for profit. She asked Meghan directly, When's the last time you spoke up about something that didn't also benefit your brand, your image, your narrative? When's the last time your activism didn't come with a media package attached? Meghan's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, anger, indignation. She responded that everything she'd done had been to create change, to use her platform for good. She brought up specific initiatives, charitable works, causes she'd championed. Her voice was rising now, becoming more animated, more defensive. She said that Whoopi was reducing her entire advocacy to some kind of calculated career move, and that was not only unfair but deliberately cruel. Whoopi cut her off. She said she wasn't questioning whether Meghan had done charitable work. She was questioning the motivation behind making sure everyone knew about it. She brought up Mother Teresa's quote about how we can do no great things, only small things with great love, and how Mother Teresa never held press conferences after visiting the sick. She said real compassion doesn't need an audience. Real advocacy doesn't require constant validation. She looked at Meghan and said, "You're not an activist. You're a celebrity who occasionally talks about social issues. There's a difference." That statement landed like a slap. Meghan stood up from her chair, not fully, but enough that it was clear she was physically reacting to what she was hearing. Sarah N. reached out as if to steady her or calm her, but Meghan pulled away. She told Whoopi that she was being deliberately hurtful, deliberately dismissive, and that this entire conversation had become a personal attack rather than a genuine discussion. She said she'd come on the show in good faith, expecting to have a respectful exchange, and instead she was being ambushed and humiliated on national television. Whoopi remained seated, but her posture was rigid. She responded that if Meghan felt attacked by being asked direct questions about her public statements and actions, then maybe those actions don't hold up under scrutiny. She said that anyone who puts themselves in the public eye, the way Meghan has, who makes their personal life the subject of documentaries and interviews and tell-all conversations, doesn't get to cry foul when someone actually engages critically with what they've said. She told Meghan that you can't have it both ways. You can't seek the spotlight and then complain about being seen. Meghan's voice cracked slightly as she responded, and you could hear real emotion breaking through the anger. She said that Whoopi didn't understand what it was like to be vilified the way she'd been vilified, to have lies printed about you in newspapers, to watch your character assassinated while being told to stay quiet and dignified. She said that every time she'd tried to correct the record, she'd been called difficult. Every time she'd defended herself, she'd been called problematic. She said she was damned if she spoke and damned if she stayed silent, and at least when she spoke, she maintained some control over her own story. Whoopi's expression softened for just a fraction of a second, something that might have been empathy flickering across her features, but then it hardened again. She told Meghan that yes, the press can be brutal. Yes, public scrutiny is painful. But, she added, and this is where her voice became almost gentle in its firmness, that's the price of the life you chose. Nobody forced you to marry into the royal family. Nobody forced you to do the Oprah interview. Nobody forced you to sign the Netflix deal. Those were choices, and choices come with consequences. Meghan shook her head vehemently. She said that Whoopi was victim-blaming, suggesting that because she'd made certain choices, she deserved whatever treatment came her way. She said that kind of logic was the same logic used to excuse all kinds of abuse and harassment. She said, just because someone chooses a public life doesn't mean they forfeit their right to be treated with basic human decency. Her voice was loud now, filling the studio, and there was a tremor in it that suggested she was either about to cry or scream or both. Whoopi stood up then, matching Meghan's energy. She said she wasn't victim-blaming, she was reality-checking. She told Meghan that calling every criticism abuse, every disagreement an attack, every challenge to your narrative a personal violation that diminishes actual abuse. That makes it harder for people who are genuinely victimized to be taken seriously. She said Meghan was crying wolf so consistently that people had stopped listening, and that wasn't the media's fault, or the public's fault, or her fault. That was on Meghan. The other hosts were completely frozen now, clearly unsure whether to intervene, how to intervene, or if intervening would just make things worse. Joy's mouth was slightly open, as if she'd started to speak several times, and thought better of it. Sunny looked between Whoopi and Meghan like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. Sarah had her hand pressed to her chest in that universal gesture of anxiety. And through it all, the cameras kept rolling. capturing every moment of this spectacular implosion. Meghan's hands were shaking visibly now. She pointed at Whoopi, and her voice came out harsh and sharp. She told Whoopi that she was a bully, plain and simple. She said that Whoopi had used this platform to humiliate her, to tear her down in front of millions of people. And for what? For ratings? For some twisted sense of putting her in her place. She said it was disgusting, and she wouldn't stand for another second of it. Whoopi's response was immediate, and her voice cut through the studio like a knife. She told Meghan that calling her a bully was rich, coming from someone who'd allegedly made staff members cry, who'd been accused by multiple sources of creating hostile work environments, who'd reportedly demanded and demeaned until people quit their jobs just to get away from her. She said that Meghan could dish it out in carefully crafted interviews where she controlled the narrative. But apparently, she couldn't take it when someone actually pushed back in real time. Meghan's face went pale and then flushed red. She demanded to know where Whoopi was getting her information. Said those were tabloid lies that had been debunked. That unnamed sources weren't credible, and using them to attack her character was journalistic malpractice. She said Whoopi was parroting the same garbage that racist media outlets had been spreading for years, and she expected better from someone who claimed to understand discrimination. Whoopi's eyes narrowed dangerously. She said that playing the race card every single time someone criticized her was insulting to people who actually faced racism. She told Meghan that, yes, she'd absolutely faced racist coverage and racist treatment. Nobody was denying that. But not every criticism is racist. Not every negative story is a conspiracy. Sometimes people just don't like your behavior, and hiding behind identity every time. Someone calls you out is manipulative and transparent. Meghan's voice reached a pitch that was almost a shout. She said that Whoopi had no right to determine what is or isn't racist. No right to dismiss her experiences just because Whoopi had decided they didn't meet her arbitrary threshold. She said that this whole conversation was proving her point, that women tear each other down, that successful black women are held to impossible standards, that speaking your truth makes you a target. She told Whoopi that she was being used, whether she realized it or not, by the same establishment forces that wanted to silence Meghan in the first place. Whoopi actually laughed at that. A genuine bark of incredulous laughter. She said that Meghan had some nerve, suggesting that she, Whoopi Goldberg, with decades of activism and advocacy and actual tangible change behind her name, was somehow a puppet of the establishment. She told Meghan that just because someone doesn't automatically agree with everything you say doesn't make them brainwashed. It makes them discerning. She said that Meghan had surrounded herself with so many yes people that she'd forgotten what actual pushback felt like. Meghan grabbed her purse from beside the chair, her movements sharp and aggressive. She told Whoopi that this conversation was over, that she refused to sit here and be insulted any longer. She said that Whoopi should be ashamed of herself for using her platform this way, for attacking another woman under the guise of tough love, or real talk, or whatever excuse she wanted to use. She called the whole thing a setup, a trap, an ambush designed to humiliate her. Whoopi stepped around the table, positioning herself between Meghan and the exit. Her voice was steady, but there was steel in it. She told Meghan that she could leave if she wanted. Nobody was holding her hostage, but she needed to hear something first. She said that Meghan's problem wasn't the media, wasn't the public, wasn't even the royal family. Meghan's problem was that she'd built her entire identity around being wronged, and she needed conflict to maintain that identity. She needed enemies. She needed persecution, because without it, she was just another wealthy celebrity with no real purpose. Meghan's eyes filled with tears. But they were tears of rage, not sadness. She told Whoopi that she knew nothing about her, nothing about what she'd been through, nothing about the strength it took to rebuild herself after everything had been taken from her. She said that Whoopi's cruelty in this moment would follow her, that people would see this for what it was, a bitter older woman tearing down someone younger out of jealousy and spite. Whoopi shook her head slowly. She said she wasn't jealous of Meghan. If anything, she felt sorry for her. She said Meghan had every advantage, every opportunity, every resource a person could want, and she'd squandered it all on grievance and revenge. She said that instead of using her platform to actually change things, Meghan had used it to wage a never-ending PR war against people who'd wronged her, real or imagined. She told Meghan, "That's not activism. That's not courage. That's just sad." Joy finally managed to get words out, her voice high and strained as she suggested they take a commercial break, that everyone could cool down and maybe continue this conversation in a more productive way. But Whoopi waved her off without looking away from Meghan. She told Meghan that she'd invited criticism by making her entire life public, and she didn't get to pick and choose which public responses she received. She said that coming on this show and expecting softball questions and sympathetic nodding was delusional. Meghan took a step toward the exit, and Whoopi didn't move to stop her, but her words followed. She told Meghan that running away was on brand, that leaving when things got difficult was apparently her signature move. She brought up leaving the royal family, leaving the UK, leaving every situation the moment it required actual resilience instead of just complaints about resilience. She said that real strength isn't giving interviews about how strong you are, it's actually demonstrating strength through action. Meghan spun around, her face twisted with fury. She told Whoopi that leaving toxic situations wasn't weakness, it was self-preservation. She said that staying in environments that destroy you just to prove some point about toughness was internalized oppression, not strength. She practically spat the words, her composure completely shattered now. She said Whoopi represented everything wrong with older generations. This toxic idea that suffering in silence is noble, that protecting yourself is cowardice. Whoopi's voice dropped to something almost conversational, which somehow made it more cutting. She told Meghan that she'd never suffered in silence. She'd simply chosen her battles wisely and fought them effectively instead of publicly. She said there's a difference between strategic silence and being silenced. She said Meghan wouldn't know the difference because she'd never learned strategy, only spectacle. She said everything about Meghan was performance. From her activism to her vulnerability to this little tantrum she was throwing right now, that word, tantrum, seemed to be the final straw. Meghan's voice came out as almost a scream. She called Whoopi a has-been, a relic, someone who'd lost touch with modern discourse and modern values. She said Whoopi's time had passed and she was lashing out at women who represented the future, because she couldn't handle becoming irrelevant. She said this interview was career suicide for Whoopi, that treating a guest this way, ambushing them and berating them on live television, was unprofessional and unhinged. Whoopi smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. She told Meghan that if anyone's career was damaged by this interview, it wouldn't be hers. She said she'd been in this industry longer than Meghan had been alive, and she'd survived much worse than a former royal throwing a fit on her show. She said Meghan could cry to her PR team, could release statements through her lawyers, could paint herself as the victim here, just like she did with everything else. But the tape would speak for itself. People would see who stayed calm and who lost control. Meghan was shaking now, her entire body vibrating with emotion. She told Whoopi she was done, completely done with this conversation and this show and Whoopi herself. She said she'd come here offering an olive branch, trying to have an honest conversation, and she'd been met with hostility and cruelty. She said it proved everything she'd ever said about how women, especially women of color, are treated when they dare to speak up. She said Whoopi had become exactly what she'd once fought against. Production staff were moving now, uncertain and hesitant, clearly receiving instructions through their earpieces about how to handle this situation. A producer appeared at the edge of the set, gesturing frantically. Sunny stood up from the table, trying to position herself between Whoopi and Meghan in some vain attempt at peacekeeping. Sarah had tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the confrontation. Joy sat frozen, looking older and more tired than she had at the start of the show. Whoopi told the producer to let Meghan leave if that's what she wanted. She said they didn't hold people against their will, not like some institutions she could name. It was a clear dig at the royal family and Meghan's claims about being trapped. Meghan caught the implication immediately and her face contorted. She called Whoopi vile, said she was a disgrace to women everywhere, to black women especially. She said history would remember this moment as Whoopi's lowest point. Tearing down another woman for sport, Whoopi's response was quiet, but carried throughout the studio. She said history would remember her for her body of work, her actual contributions to society and culture, and civil rights. She asked Meghan what history would remember her for besides marrying well and complaining loudly. She said that burned bridges and scorched earth don't build legacies. They just leave you isolated with nothing but your grievances for company. Security personnel had entered the studio now, not aggressively but present, clearly prepared to escort Meghan out, if necessary. Meghan looked at them, looked back at Whoopi with pure hatred in her eyes, and told her they were done. She said Whoopi would regret this, that her team would be in contact, that there would be consequences for this ambush. She used that word again, ambush, as if answering challenging questions was somehow an attack rather than basic. Journalism, Whoopi told her to do whatever she needed to do. She said she'd been threatened by better people than Meghan and survived just fine. She said Meghan's lawyers could call her lawyers and they could all have a wonderful time discussing how asking someone direct questions about their public statements constituted some kind of actionable offense. She said she'd welcome that conversation, actually, because it would further expose how Meghan operated. Using legal threats and PR campaigns instead of actually engaging with criticism, Meghan turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the studio floor. The security personnel followed at a respectful distance, not touching her, but clearly prepared to intervene if needed. As she reached the edge of the set, she turned back one final time. Her voice carried across the studio, shaking but determined. She told Whoopi that she'd underestimated her, that this wasn't over, that Whoopi had no idea who she was dealing with. It sounded like a threat and a promise and a plea all mixed together. Whoopi remained standing at the table, her arms crossed, watching Meghan's exit with an expression that was hard to read. When Meghan finally disappeared from view, followed by security and several frantic producers, Whoopi sat down heavily in her chair. The other hosts were still in various states of shock. Joy found her voice first, making some comment about needing a strong drink. Sunny looked dazed. Sarah wiped at her eyes, and Whoopi just sat there staring at the camera, as production staff scrambled to figure out what to do next. So there you have it. What started as a routine celebrity interview spiraled into one of the most explosive confrontations daytime television has ever witnessed. Two powerful women, two completely different perspectives, and absolutely no middle ground found. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and drop a comment below with your answer to this question. Do you think Whoopi crossed a line with her questions, or was Meghan too sensitive to handle legitimate criticism?